Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first official episode of our first podcast at CSVR, the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation. This is exciting because this is a new pathway for us, and we are so excited at the possibilities that may come from this. And I am your host for the day. My name is Athini Magodla, and I am the Gender Assistant at the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation. And today we have such a wonderful and commendable guest, Caroline Peters. I will let her introduce herself a little later on, but today we're really here to talk about the relationship, the nexus between food security and gender, and basically the impact of food insecurity within the Western Cape when it comes to gender-related matters. Caroline, welcome to the show. If you may, could you please kindly introduce yourself?
Hi, Athini, and thank you. I didn't realize I was the first one, so I feel quite honored that CSVR has chosen to do this podcast with me first. And so, yes, I'm just as excited to do this podcast with you. It has been in the making for a while, and so we're here. So thank you, Athini, for this, and CSVR for this opportunity. My name is Caroline Peters. I am an African feminist and human rights defender. I work in Cape Town in the Western Cape of South Africa. I have been in this field of gender-based violence in the gender sector for the past 35 years. So I have a long history of working in the sector. And my work with food insecurity started in 2018. So the nexus of food insecurity and gender-based violence work has been my field since 2018, when I first encountered a woman with a blue eye or black eye that did not ask me for services for the violence, but asked for a plate of food. So I'll start with that. Thank you, Athini.
Thank you so much, Caroline, for that introduction. As I've mentioned, today we're discussing an issue that affects many communities in Cape Town and in the broader Western Cape region, food security. And food security is a critical challenge as it refers to the ability of individuals and communities to access sufficient, nutritious food at all times. However, the issue is not one size fits all. In fact, food security is deeply influenced by social factors such as gender, race, and socioeconomic status. And in the context of the Western Cape, these factors create unique challenges, especially for women and people of color. Historically, the legacy of apartheid and ongoing socioeconomic disparities have left many marginalized communities struggling with poverty, unemployment, and limited access to resources, which directly impacts their ability to access food. At the same time, gender roles within households and communities often dictate who is responsible for food production, food preparation, and decision-making, adding another layer of complexity to food security. Women, especially women of color, are disproportionately affected by food insecurity in Cape Town. They often face the dual burden of ensuring food security at home while navigating systematic barriers, including limited access to land, economic resources, and opportunities for empowerment. So food security within the Western Cape is really one of those things that is less talked about, but it's such a persisting issue within the Western Cape at large. Perhaps to kickstart the conversation, Caroline, could you perhaps briefly describe your community's general experience with food security? How would you define food security in the context of Western Cape?
Thank you, Athini. So, as you said, food security in the Western Cape remains unevenly distributed, with many communities struggling to access consistent and nutrition and affordable food. So, for communities supported by our organization, food security extends beyond survival. And if I look, it's tied to their dignity, equality, and the constitutional right. Often, just recently we had challenges with others in the community that was struggling with the idea that we have a few hundred people we serve outside every day. But for me, nobody even speak about the constitutional right to food under Section 27(1)(b). So our foundation's works highlight that achieving food security is essential for the well-being of individuals and the development of a just and democratic society. And as I said to you earlier when I started, so in 2018, so for years I worked from the 90s, I've been working in the gender sector. And 2018, when this woman came to knock, she didn't speak about the violence in a relationship. There was clear violence. She came with a child and a blue eye, but she asked for something to eat for her and a child. And by this time, she and the child both didn't have anything to eat for 2 days. And often, just like gender-based violence is pervasive, so is food insecurity. And for a lot of people, it's about the dignity, and therefore people go hungry. Now, I think COVID has taught many people that it's okay to come to the food, to the community kitchen, So food insecurity undermines our constitutional right to equality and dignity. It disproportionately impacts women and people of color, exactly like you say. As I was sitting waiting on you to start the podcast, I was thinking, we are based in Athlone, in the demographics of the Western Cape. I'm based in Athlone and we run a community kitchen here, Athini, and just about 10 minutes from here is another suburb. And in that suburb, you could probably live on the road and live out of those people's bins by the food that is disposed there. We're 10 minutes away from there. So this is how huge food insecurity is for some communities. So these groups we face systemic barriers rooted in historical inequalities, like you say, the apartheid, etc. But it's systemic barriers that needs to be. So the Callas Foundation, we address this by ensuring food access through our community kitchen and advocating for policies that will support the vulnerable, recognizing that food security is fundamental to realizing the full benefits of our democracy.
Very important, actually. So many things that you've highlighted, and they're all connected. And thank you for actually highlighting the fact that, access to food is a fundamental human right. And, in access to food is in itself a form of violence that needs to be discussed separately. And, it's such an important way to also start off the conversation by highlighting the importance of access to food and how that's connected to human dignity. And, thank you for highlighting that, actually. So, you've mentioned that food security affects people of color differently. It affects women differently. And so perhaps maybe we can dive in a little bit on that. How do you think food insecurity affects different groups in your community, particularly women and people of color?
For the record, I live in a historically what people call colored community. Just 2 minutes away from me is Langa. On the other side of me, there's Bonteheuwel, there's Heideveld. Then 2 minutes on the other way, there's Rondebosch East. So very varied, very different communities I live in the midst of. And when I look at persons of color, and so I want to tell you, we often also don't speak about the violence around food insecurity. So we run a community kitchen, and most of our clients are males. And I want to tell you, it's because of the gang violence on the Cape Flats. So Bridgetown, where I live in, does not have organized crime like you will find in Bonteheuwel, Heideveld, Manenberg, Hanover Park. So men cannot walk there freely because there are gang violence. Bridgetown is still, we're very organized as a community. It's one of the oldest communities on the Cape Flats, and gangs do not invade here like they do in other areas. So when we speak food insecurity, there's so many nexus we can speak to, but especially the violence, Athini. And so our clients are more males than females. And when we did the study, and there was a study done by think tank Sustainability and Organization from Germany, did some research. Our community kitchens were enumerated, etc., etc. And it clearly showed that our clients were more males than females. But then what showed up for Bridgetown was also that because Bridgetown does not have organized gangs as in the other areas, and then when we spoke to the men in the skill, that was why they are here. So you would find men of color on the Cape Flats also have the nexus of gang violence and where it's accessible for them to go to. And often also because of people of color, men, and I think just generally black men have a lot of responsibilities placed on them as the provider. And yes, some of them step up to those roles. So we know there's those men that have no regard for that role. However, historically, it is men of color has got to bring the food home in the evening. And what I found was that you will find men here that didn't find, the men along the road that wait for a day's job. So we serve 3 o'clock in the afternoon. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they have not had a casual job for the day. They come with their bowls and they take a bowl of food home for their families. And I know that has been a big thing for me, that to see that and to experience that. So as a feminist and an organization that has worked, in fact, our work was with women and the girl child. I want to say that made me realize, and that is where we started the boys program and looked at the nexus of how food insecurity drives gender-based violence, etc., etc. So gender roles often place the burden of food preparation and caregiving on women. I can go on to tell you that, we have women sitting in this queue. So the one woman cried and she said, please put in rice in that bowl and food in that bowl. And it sounds silly, but this was a woman that said to us, if I go home and he knows that I stood in a community kitchen, he's going to hit me. And I need to, and so for some, it is the woman and most parts, it is always the women. So I want to tell you, the only reason why we have more male clients is because, like I said, of the violence elsewhere in the Cape Flats. However, women do the food preparation and the caregiving is on women mostly. So the men in the queue is not necessarily from this area, but it would be men that walk from other areas because they cannot access. Even men staying in Bonteheuwel can't go on to the other part of Bonteheuwel because that is ruled by a different gang. So if you know the violence, the nexuses between these things, So we help to counter this by empowering women through food security programs. We do sewing, we do food gardening, etc., So thank you, Athini. Over to you.
You briefly spoke about men being providers and they sort of have the expectation to provide for their families. This is something, that's often omitted in conversations. And perhaps, I really just want to talk a little bit, just briefly about, in terms of your experience as well, what is the emotions like when when a man comes into your organization and they're asking you for food? I'm assuming there's a lot of shame around. There's a lot of guilt, feelings of failure that they weren't able to provide for their families, for their daughters, for their sons, perhaps. Maybe you can run through those kind of aspects.
Athini, I first experienced this during COVID, and what always stood out for me was that one of those men that came to knock on my door with so much shame, 2 weeks later, he died of COVID and a heart attack. And he was a young man, and that will always stand out for me. And I think, as a radical feminist over the years, my perspective around that, not just lazy, really changed for me. I realized that the role and how men, the shame that as community sometimes we add to men and the responsibilities that they feel, and I often and that made me start looking at it differently. I explored things more differently. And so therefore, like I said to you earlier before I ended off there, that's why we started the boys program. We work with boys from 10 years old in the organization, because I also found that, once I really, and this stood out for me when this man came to knock on my door because he couldn't work during COVID, and he came to knock on my door for a hamper because we were at this stage giving out hampers to the community. And then 2 weeks later, he was gone for a heart attack. And it really struck me that man will always, that picture plays out in my head of the shame that he had on his face when he came here, And so, just to answer your question, Athini, that made me start working with men and boys differently, and not include them in all the programs, because I also realized at the stage the need there was to hold the space for men, to make sure that, and when we look at the violence in the communities, yes, men are mostly the perpetrators of the violence, but also since then we've had more male clients. Our organization now work a lot more with men, and the men that comes to our community kitchen also feel more welcome here, because it's something that we ensure, because you see the shame, and we know when there's someone new in the queue, the shame that goes with it. And so that's why we walk our queue. When you come to put your name down and your address and where you're from, etc., we make sure that staff make you feel welcome. Staff make you feel, the team make you feel that almost it's okay to be here. You don't have to carry that shame, for the men. So we've done a lot of work around that. And I really want us to highlight that men feel the shame and the guilt and the burden of the household. And often when they cannot provide that, their default is violence.
Such an interesting take, Caroline. This is obviously deeply entrenched and connected to gender roles and what is expected within the households. Men are supposed to be the providers, and so when they don't fulfill that role, there's a certain outcome. And I think that's also something that we as researchers and people working within this terrain, we need to look into more deeply. And really question the relationship between gender roles and food security, whether it is in the aspect of food preparation, food production, or food distribution. Gender roles has an impact on how we access food. And perhaps to speak, more about women, perhaps in your experience, how do women in your community engage in food production or farming, and what challenges do they face in accessing resources like water and financial support?
So because we live in a very fairly built up, there's the access to water is here. We don't live in a farming community. We live in the city where those things are accessible. But I know we have kitchens, so I also coordinate a kitchen network. And from these kitchens, even kitchens in Umfaleli, kitchens in Masipumaleli, they make fire for their food production. And the women, and of all these kitchens, all of them are run by women. The cooks are women. So the food preparation, the hustle for the food. And I often look at the queue, and I don't think that people realize how much we as the directors of organizations, it has taken me from 2018 to now to have enough goods for the kitchen from the first to the end of the month. I mean, I used to have sleepless nights that there's not enough rice, there's not enough oil. We used to send out umpteen flyers. I almost had a it's like a trigger if I think how I had to beg for food, and the food was not for me, it was for, and this is not just me. These are ordinary women in communities. I had a bigger network to access. I had more organizations that I knew that I could ask, more people that I knew, but these were ordinary women that started because of a need, responded to the need in COVID, and then continued to carry on with these kitchens. And I want to say, so for many people, they when COVID was over, people's life went back to normal. Yes, we lived in a new normal now, but for many households, unemployment is even higher. And so they never returned back to normal. And so the community kitchens became the beacon of hope, of light, etc. And all of our kitchens, none of us just cook. all those kitchens in the kitchen networks, we run other programs, some run ECD, some run. So we do gender-based violence is our main focus. We do access to justice. We do the boys program. We do the human rights clubs in schools. We do, we advocate for non-custodial measures for women in conflict with the law. And you might say, so what has food security got to do with all of this? And this is why I'm saying to you, studies have shown there's empirical evidence that where there is food insecurity, women are more likely to be in violent relationships. So for me, it is systemic. So women in Callas support communities that are often involved in like small scale farming. We've got few of the women, there's hydroponics farming and food production, but we face barriers like limited access to land, especially in the built up areas, the access to land is not always good. So the resources that should be available to all under the right to food, it's not, Athini, it's not. So, our Gardens for Change, and we've tried that model. And this is also, again, well documented. We started the Gardens for Change. And so within this kitchen network, we exchange food, etc., to ensure. But we've also, and it's just reached its 3 years lifespan. So 3 years ago, we started on this project with a think tank sustainability organization in Germany, was funded by them with a small stipend for the women to keep record and to ensure these. So with this we provide training in gender-based violence and ensure that women use the kitchen as a vehicle or an organization in the community for change. We provide training, tools and advocacy tools to these kitchens, to be able to contribute sustainable food systems here.
Yeah, thank you so much actually for also just highlighting COVID-19, because often when we talk about food insecurity within South African or within the Southern African context, we often talk about things like apartheid and colonization and unemployment, but often we omit how COVID-19 has exacerbated food insecurity within particularly Black households and, colored households as well. And so it's such an important thing to actually mention in such conversations as well, to acknowledge that COVID-19, as much as it has, so-called left us, the residual effects are still within us. They're still within our homes and they affect how we access food sometimes. So perhaps, Caroline, to speak about the intersectionality between race, gender, and food insecurity. In your experience, perhaps, how does food insecurity manifest differently among people of color in Cape Town, particularly women? Are there any particular barriers that affect this group more severely?
Most definitely, women are always more affected by this. So if we look at systemic inequalities, between men and women, we know that men often have access to different. I'm trying to think of an example. I like to tell stories with how I say, but when we look at the systemic race, gender, and food insecurity, women of color food insecurity is compounded by systemic inequalities rooted in apartheid and ongoing socio-economic challenges. So the barriers are directly to the right to food and dignity. But if I look at women of color, I often think of, again, I want to say it's systemic. It's where the women are normally the one that is supposed to prepare the food, and it almost lies on her shoulders to make sure that her children eat at night. And so apartheid era land dispossession, systemic exclusion denied women of color access to resources necessary for food security. So the historical injustice continue to shape the landscape of inequality today. So we work in community kitchens and advocate for the right to land. So I want to tell you, so for me, when we wanted to do a hydroponic gardens, there was a piece of land available. It belonged to the city. It took us a year to write, to challenge, to meetings. We still don't have it 2 years later, So these are, and then that's what I want to say, it's systemic things. And then the land, eventually you see there's something else on there. And then when I looked at who got the land, it was a group of men, And so again, I felt aggrieved that as an organization, we wanted to assist the community. And so now only a few people are benefiting from that land. And if you look at, I don't want to, but if you look at the city, the councillor is a male. And so I often feel like the males favor the males in systemic things. So it's historical injustice. It continues. So cultural food practices. Oh, and this is also what I wanted to say. Often we just think community kitchens, and, we think if we look at community kitchens, we also just tend to think that people should be grateful for what they receive at community kitchens. But we do not think about cultural food practice, It's deeply tied to identity and dignity. So how do I serve food that's not so sampan beans, for instance? Sampan beans, it's something that people of color and black people eat. isiXhosa speaking and English speaking people both eat the same thing. But if I make a dish that's traditionally isiXhosa dish, I can't serve it here in my community. So we often, and if we look at nutrition for everyone, so we serve legumes, we serve soya. Community kitchens, most kitchens don't have the luxury of serving meat. We would serve meat 2-3 times a year as donations allow. I know for some community kitchens that's supported by government, etc., different programs, they have meat. But for most, I would say for 95% of us, that's not the case. So this cultural food practice play a part in food security for people of color. So we respect practices providing we provide culturally appropriate meals, Athini, through our kitchens, ensuring that food security aligns with dignity and cultural identity. Did I answer that right? I almost feel like I haven't. And I didn't speak. I want to speak about the gendered role in food. So like I said, women are often the preparers. We prepare the food, we cook the food, and we are the distributors of the food. You won't find men dishing up in a house. It would normally be the mother, etc., etc. And that is also that role is assigned in gender roles to women. The man is supposed to bring, so like they say, you bring the bacon home, you bring the money home to make sure that the woman then does the cooking and the preparation and the dishing, etc., etc. And we see this with food insecurity. And often I want to say to you, because of systemic things again, unemployment, poverty, etc., men cannot do their function or their role or their gendered role as society as we are socialized. So it becomes an issue with the violence in the relationships.
It's such an enormous challenge that you've acknowledged just around the cultural food practice. And, it's something that I, for one, actually am hearing it for the first time, and sort of something that I've never actually have to think about. That, people like you who help communities as far as food is concerned would have to also consider different cultures when serving food. And it's such a challenge, I imagine. But I really want to speak more about the gender roles that you've mentioned now. Have you found that perhaps in certain households, gender roles tend to change when there is a challenge of food security? Perhaps you find the maternal figures within the household are out, working and sort of being the providers. And then perhaps the father of the house has to be the one serving the food and preparing the food. Have you sort of had any experience in that regard where gender roles within household tend to change?
Yes, definitely. And I think since COVID-19, we found it more. And just the way our economy is going, Athini, we find more of that. And I want to say we have more men than we've ever had as clients at Callas Foundation. So, we offer psychosocial support, we do court support, etc., etc. Just today, I was supporting a male client that is in an abusive relationship. And so when we got it the first time, it was very unreal almost, because the way we socialize, if a man can't defend himself, then is he a girl? I mean, really, and that was the language we use, etc., etc. And so you do find there's more households now than ever where the woman is the breadwinner. And I'm not talking about single-headed households. I'm talking about where there's two, like there's a gender of a male and a female, the historical socialized household, whatever you want to call that. So you do find more of that, and that is why I'm saying, interestingly, if you come to our kitchen, 60% of our clients are males, and it is because we make males feel okay that they come here to come collect food for their families, and often, and because they sit for hours outside our kitchen, we also almost felt like at one stage. In fact, this year we are going to start having the support group for men, and make sure that men have dialogues while they're sitting outside, those hours that they're sitting outside the kitchen waiting, you know?
I think as you're speaking, and you sort of basically mentioned some of the historical factors that contribute to food insecurity, I'm just thinking about also just the lack of sustainability within food security. The measures that are already there, I feel like in some way they're a little bit, they're not sustainable at all, quite frankly. I'm thinking things like social grants, and I'm imagining a home with, 5 family members and they're only receiving one social grant. That, for me it is unsustainable. And, it's a huge challenge within a household. Do you think that, the current measures at play to combat food insecurity within South Africa at large, I suppose, do you think that these measures are sustainable or not?
No, So sustainability for addressing food insecurity, we need to implement long-term systemic solutions, and to ensure that we have access to food without compromising our future generations' ability. And if we look at gardens, so one of the projects that we had was the Gardens for Change. How do we bring it down to that, Athini? I almost want to say we need to take a step back. With agroecology, using environmentally friendly farming methods, we need to do agriculture more and more and more in our communities. I remember growing up with us having a small garden, and how that was, how are we going to localize food systems with a community kitchen? How will it go from farm to table? How are we going to do those models? How are we going to implement that? What do we need to do? We need to get to a thing where it's, because just think, a farmer sells a cabbage. I'm just making a cabbage a thing for 5 rand to the market, or just say 2 rand a cabbage to the market. By the time it gets to the households, it's 30 rand. It's gone up so much. How are we going to get to a stage where we are going to grow our food? We saw during COVID-19. COVID-19 taught us so much. How people started gardening, people started doing things because there wasn't access to many things, and people started growing that. And then all of a sudden COVID-19 ends, and that ends. But the reality is that food insecurity has never left us.
Yeah.
Athini, I have seen the same amounts of people in the queue since COVID maybe was a bit more, and then a drop for a while. But we have now, just last week, we served 400 people. I was so anxious. I looked at the food and I looked at the queue. And some days We just don't know where these people come from. But people are hungry and people sit outside for hours waiting for a plate of food. And do we want our next generation to also have the same thing, So how are we going to look at food cooperatives, so the farm to table models, land reforms, land tenure security? We must empower women and marginalized groups. We need to do skills training, leadership development, reduce food waste. We shouldn't be so food insecure. We have enough food production in the Western Cape so that nobody should go hungry, but we do not speak about that even enough, How do we ensure that restaurants and other kitchens, hotels, etc., donate surplus food from retailers, restaurants, and households, composting initiatives, consumer awareness, and all these things. And of course, then climate justice. When do we speak about climate changes, etc., etc.? So we have a lot of work to do with here.
You're right, Caroline. It's such an interesting take, actually, that, as much as we do have enough food production within the Western Cape particularly, and perhaps in South Africa at large, there's such a huge disconnect because a lot of South Africans cannot afford food. And so I feel like that's such an interesting disconnect and paradox, so to speak. Perhaps a more reflective question, looking into the future, what changes would you like to see to improve food security for women and people of color within the Western Cape? And what do you what role do you think gender equality should play?
A huge role. If we look at socialization and we look at gender inequality, that is where all these start. So the future efforts must prioritize systemic changes that uphold the right to food for all, which will be inequality, Gender inequality is critical as empowering women ensures more equitable and sustainable solution. So our work demonstrates that community-driven models can transform food systems and align with the vision of a progressive and democratic South Africa that reduces gender-based violence.
And if you could send a message to policymakers, community leaders, farmers, food security people, what message would it be?
I want to say the right to food is not optional. It is a constitutional mandate. Policymakers must recognize that food security is foundational to dignity, equality, and democracy. Investing in gender-sensitive, community-driven solutions like those implemented by our organization can ensure a more just and sustainable society for all.
And in closing, Caroline, is there anything else you'd like to share about your experience with food security and its gendered aspect in Cape Town?
Okay, so our work underscores that food security is about more than just sustenance. It's about dignity. And I can't say that more. Athini, it is something I've taught our team. Dignity, justice and equality. So by addressing the root causes of food insecurity and empowering women, we can build a society that truly fulfills the promise of Section 27(1)(b) and the ideals of a democratic South Africa. Thank you, Athini.
And for anyone listening out there, Caroline, where can we find you? Where can we come help? How do we connect with you?
So our organization is Callas Foundation. Visit our website, www.callasfoundation.org.za, CALLAS, callasfoundation.org.za. Follow us on social media. Look out for Callas Foundation. Our organization's number is 072-539-5113.
Caroline, again, thank you so much for your time. I'm truly appreciative to have this conversation with you. And I must say, I really admire the commendable work that you continuously do without fail. And it's such a privilege to know somebody like you. And I can only ask you to please continue the work that you do. We need people like you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Athini.